They said no man could survive when 100 Apache warriors circled his home. But when Samuel Carter found a dying girl in the dust outside his fence, he didn't think about the odds he carried her inside. By dawn, the horizon was black with riders, their war drums shaking the earth. And then, she pointed to the chief on the ridge and whispered one word that changed everything, Father. Follow my story until the very end, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from so I can see just how far this tale travels. The sun was bleeding into the mesa's edge when Samuel Carter spotted something collapsed by his water well. From a distance, it might have been a stray mule or a wounded deer. Out here, either could mean trouble. He shifted his rifle against his shoulder and stepped closer, his boots crunching in the red grit. Then he froze. It was a girl. No older than 16, her long black hair was matted with blood sticking to a face pale from blood loss. Her lips were cracked, her eyes fluttering half open before sinking shut again. Her dress, Apache style, was torn and stained with dirt. Samuel's gut tightened. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. He knelt 2 calloused fingers to her neck. Faint pulse. Shallow breaths. Whoever she was, she didn't have much time. A voice in his head reminded him of the risk. Taking in an Apache, especially a young woman, could spark a war. Every settler knew the territorial lines here were drawn in blood. But the way she lay there broken and alone stripped away his hesitation. "You're not dying out here," he said quietly. Sliding the rifle onto his back, Samuel scooped her up, startled by how light she was. Her head lolled against his chest as he carried her to the cabin. Inside, he laid her on the bed, the same bed he hadn't shared with anyone since his wife passed 5 years ago. The oil lamp flickered to life shadows stretching across the rough-hewn walls. Samuel grabbed clean cloth well water and the small bottle of whiskey he kept for emergencies. When he cleaned her arms, he stopped cold. The cuts weren't random. They formed deliberate cruel patterns, torture. She stirred, mumbling something in Apache. Her voice was weak like wind slipping through cracks. "Easy," he murmured. "You're safe now." She opened her eyes, a fraction fear flickering there, then something else. Maybe hope. She whispered again, but the words were lost on him. "Wish I knew what you were saying," Samuel said, wringing out a cloth and pressing it gently to her forehead. The hours bled together as he worked. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes moaning softly, sometimes speaking to people who weren't there. Samuel kept talking, his voice low, steady, half to calm her, half to convince himself he was doing the right thing. By midnight, her breathing had evened out. Samuel eased into the wooden chair beside the bed rifle across his knees. Outside, the desert was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that made you listen harder. He didn't sleep. Sometime past 3, a coyote howled far off. Samuel's eyes stayed on the dark window. His mind played out the possibilities, how fast he could saddle his horse where the nearest canyon cover was, how long it would take for someone to track her here. Toward morning, she stirred again. Her hand twitched toward his arm before falling back. Samuel watched her chest rise and fall, slow and steady now. A pale glow touched the horizon. The day was coming, and with it trouble. The first sound was so faint, Samuel thought it might have been wind shifting over the ridge. Then it came again, low, rhythmic, steady. Hoofbeats. Many of them. He rose from the chair, every muscle tense, and crossed to the small window. The horizon was still gray, but the light was just enough to show movement on the far edge of the basin. Dark figures on horseback riding in slow, deliberate formation. "Damn it," he whispered. The girl stirred on the bed. Her eyes blinked open, unfocused at first, then snapping to him when she saw his expression. Samuel kept his voice low. "You'd better see this." She tried to sit, but winced in pain. He moved to help, steadying her as they stepped to the window. When she saw the riders, her breath caught. Her hand went to the glass, trembling, and she whispered something in Apache that sounded like a prayer, or maybe a curse. Then she looked at him, eyes wide, and in halting English said, "Ayana." "That your name?" Samuel asked. She nodded once, then lifted her chin toward the largest figure on the ridge, an older man in a long feathered headdress. She whispered another word. "Father." The weight of it hit Samuel like a hammer. He wasn't just sheltering an Apache girl, he was harboring the daughter of a war chief. And judging from the growing number of riders fanning out around his property, the chief hadn't come alone. The circle closed in slow measured increments. 20 riders. 30. more slipping into view from behind rocks and shallow creek beds. They didn't rush him, didn't shout. They moved like men with all the time in the world, sealing every possible escape. Ayanna gripped his sleeve suddenly, her voice urgent in Apache. He shook his head. I don't understand you. She pointed to herself, then outside, then back to him, repeating the gesture with more force. The message was clear enough. This was about her, and it was dangerous. The hoofbeats grew louder as one rider detached from the formation and approached the cabin. He stopped well out of rifle range. White man? The voice rang out across the morning air, accented but clear. You have something that belongs to us. Samuel's jaw tightened. She's not a thing. Ayanna's grip on his arm tightened. Her eyes pleaded with him, though he couldn't tell if she was asking to stay or begging to go. The rider's tone hardened. Send her out now and maybe you live to see another day. Samuel glanced at his rifle in the corner, then at the girl. Her lips trembled. No, she said in broken English, shaking her head. She pushed back the torn sleeve of her dress, revealing the cut Samuel had cleaned in the night. In the pale dawn light, he could see the patterned, deliberate, ceremonial cruel. He felt his stomach knot. What did they do to you? Before she could answer, movement on the ridge caught his eye. Another rider was galloping in, younger than the first, but dressed with the same warrior pride. He pulled up sharply, calling out in English that was rough but urgent. Sister. Are you alive? Ayanna's head snapped toward the voice. Her reply was fast in Apache and thick with emotion. The young man looked past her to Samuel. I am Kolo. My sister was taken by white men slavers from the east. She escaped. You helped her. Samuel kept his eyes on the gathering circle of warriors. Found her at my fence half dead, cleaned her wounds, gave her water. Kolo turned to the men behind him, speaking rapidly in Apache. Some nodded, others scowled. On the ridge, the older man, her father, no doubt watched like a hawk, every motion measured. Then the chief himself urged his horse forward. He stopped 10 feet from the cabin, his eyes fixed on Samuel. I am Natona, war chief of the Chiricahua Apache. This is my daughter. Bring her to me. It wasn't a request. Ayanna stepped forward before Samuel could answer, calling to her father in Apache. Her voice was quick, urgent, with Samuel's name slipping into the flow of words more than once. The chief listened without changing expression. When she finished, he sat silent for a long moment before speaking. She says you saved her life, asked nothing, expected nothing. Samuel met his gaze, couldn't let her die. Natona's eyes narrowed, studying him. Many men would have. Many white men would have taken instead of given. From the left flank, another rider suddenly urged his horse forward. He was younger than Natona, but carried himself with authority. His voice was sharp in Apache, his gestures toward Samuel full of accusation. Ayanna's face paled. Takaro, she whispered. War leader under my father. Natona's tone turned hard, but Takaro didn't back down. Finally, the man turned his glare on Samuel. White man's word is nothing. Today you help, tomorrow you bring soldiers. Better to kill you now. Samuel's hands tightened into fists. I'm not that kind of man. Takaro spat into the dust. Prove it. The challenge hung heavy in the desert air, the kind that could change everything for Samuel Carter before the sun climbed much higher. Samuel's eyes shifted between the chief, the war leader, and the tightening circle of warriors. The air between them felt like a drawn bowstring, one wrong word and it would snap. Natona's gaze was steady, but there was a weight behind it, the kind of patience a man carried when he'd survived more wars than he could count. Takaro's eyes, however, burned with something sharper, mistrust sharpened into contempt. Ayanna stepped forward, speaking rapidly in Apache, her voice urgent, almost pleading. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but he could feel the push in her tone defending him, trying to cut through the suspicion before it turned into something worse. Takaro barked a reply, his voice rising. He gestured toward the hills as if pointing out some invisible danger only he could see, then jabbed a finger toward Samuel. What's he saying? Samuel asked quietly. Kolo, still holding his horse back, glanced over his shoulder. He says you bring trouble. That mercy for a white man will be seen as weakness. He says the soldiers will come if you live. Samuel's jaw tightened. I don't plan on telling anyone about this. Not where you camp, not about your people. Takaro leaned forward in his saddle, his English rough but venomous. White men always lie. You have reason today. Tomorrow you have gold in your eyes. Samuel felt the heat rise in his chest. If I wanted gold, I'd have left your sister in the dirt. I'd be miles away by now. For a moment no one moved. Then Ayana did something Samuel didn't expect. She left his side and walked straight toward Takaro's horse. Every warrior's eyes followed her, some murmuring under their breath. She looked up at the war leader, speaking with an intensity that cut through the stillness. Her hands moved as she talked, pointing to her wounds, to Samuel, to the cuts on her arms. Natona's face shifted slightly, almost imperceptible, but Samuel caught it. Whatever she was saying was having an effect. Takaro's expression changed, the fury dimming to something closer to thought. The war leader dismounted, dust puffing around his boots as he stepped toward Samuel. Every instinct in Samuel's body told him to reach for the rifle leaning just inside the doorway, but he stayed still. Takaro stopped an arm's length away, his eyes raking over Samuel's face before dropping to his hands. He reached out suddenly, taking one of Samuel's palms and turning it upward. Scars, Takaro said, his voice quieter now. Not soft hands, hands of work. Samuel said nothing, unsure if it was an insult or a grudging respect. Takaro's gaze flicked toward the cabin. She says you have picture of dead woman on table. She says you know loss. Samuel's throat tightened. He didn't remember Ayana noticing the photograph of his wife. Natona finally spoke, his voice carrying over the silent ring of warriors. Takaro accepts my decision. But his pause was deliberate. He says trust must be proven. There is camp of slavers near Snake Creek. They wait for more captives, women and children. We will strike today. Takaro says, if you ride with us, fight with us, and free them, then your word is strong. Samuel studied the chief, then Takaro. You're asking me to go after them with you. Yes, Natona said simply. If your heart is as you say, you will not refuse. The memory of the cages Ayana must have been kept in flashed through his mind. The terror in her eyes when she first woke up. His quiet life back at the ranch seemed 1,000 miles away. He let out a slow breath. When do we leave? Now the chief replied. In moments the air shifted. What had been a standoff was suddenly a preparation for war. Warriors tightened saddle straps, checked rifles, passed waterskins. One of them brought Samuel a sturdy, dark-coated horse. Kolo rode up beside him, handing him a rifle with fresh rounds. Stay close to me when we ride. The land will test you before the fight does. Ayana approached, her strength returning despite the stiffness in her movements. Thank you, she said in broken English, eyes locked on his. For life, for honor. He gave her a small nod, unable to find words that felt right. The war party moved out, fanning into the open desert with the fluid ease of men who had ridden together for years. Samuel kept his seat low in the saddle, copying Kolo's posture, watching how the Apaches picked their way through narrow gullies and dry washes without leaving obvious tracks. Hours passed in silence, but for the thud of hooves and the occasional hand signal from Natonana or Takaro. The terrain grew rougher, jagged rock outcrops, thorn brush snagging at his sleeves. Sudden drops into hidden ravines. Still, the warriors moved like they'd been born to it. Finally, they halted on a ridge overlooking a wide clearing by a slow bend in the creek. Samuel's stomach tightened. Below, just as the chief had said, stood a cluster of wagons with iron cages built into their frames, and the cages weren't empty. Through the morning haze, Samuel could see shapes inside the cages, faces pressed to the bars, hands clutching the iron. Women, some barely older than girls. Children huddled together, their eyes hollow, their movements slow with exhaustion. The sight hit him harder than he expected, twisting something deep in his gut. Natona crouched beside him, his voice low but firm. 15 guards. Well armed. They think they are safe here. Takaro slid in on the other side, scanning the camp with sharp, predatory eyes. We split, he said in English so Samuel could follow. Half attack from the north, draw them out. The rest hit from the back, free the captives. Quick, quiet, until it is time. Samuel kept his gaze on the cages. I'll go with the rescue group, he said without hesitation. Natona gave him a short nod. Good. The moment their attention turns, you move. Every heartbeat will matter. They lay in wait until the sun slid lower shadows stretching long across the creek bed. The air seemed to hold its breath. Samuel's palms were damp on the stock of the rifle Kolo had handed him earlier. His heart beat slow heavy, every thump a reminder of what was about to happen. From the far side of the camp came the sudden piercing cry of an Apache war whoop, then another and another, until the sound rolled like thunder down the ridge. Gunfire cracked, men shouted, and the slavers scrambled to meet the attack they thought was coming head-on. Now Takaro hissed. The rescue group surged forward, riding low through the brush. Samuel kept close to Kolo, the ground rushing under the pounding of hooves. They slid from the saddle before the wagons, the metallic stink of the cages hitting Samuel like a slap. He ran to the nearest one, 3 young women inside, eyes wide with terror. "We're here to help," he said, fumbling for the padlock. His hands worked fast, adrenaline giving him speed. The lock snapped with a twist from Takaro's pry tool, and the door swung open. The girls didn't move at first, like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. "Go!" Samuel urged, voice sharp. "Run for the rocks!" Other warriors were already at the next wagon, their blades and tools breaking chains, pulling captives out into the cooling evening air. Screams and shouts rang from the northern side of camp, where Natona's group kept the guards pinned down in a storm of gunfire. But the ruse didn't last forever. A shout went up, and Samuel turned to see 3 armed slavers sprinting toward them, rifles in hand. He raised his weapon, fired. One man fell. The other 2 kept coming. Takaro stepped into their path, his rifle barking twice, both shots finding their mark. "Keep moving," he snapped, reloading without looking. Samuel ran to the last cage where 2 small children clung to the bars. Their faces were streaked with dirt and tears, their clothes in tatters. He yanked the door open and lifted the boy out, then the girl, pressing them toward an older woman who had just been freed. "Take them," he said. "Stay low." The chaos closed in. More slavers were breaking away from the main fight, moving to cut off the rescuers. Bullets hissed past, spitting dirt. Samuel felt one whip so close by his ear it left a ringing inside his skull. Kolo appeared, half carrying a young Mexican woman who could barely stand. "She's hurt," he called. Samuel moved to take her other arm, the 3 of them pushing toward the cover of the rocks where other freed captives were gathering. Behind them, Takaro and 2 warriors laid down fire, driving back the last of the slaver resistance. The battle turned hard and fast. A final gunshot echoed, then the shouting died, replaced by the ragged sound of captives breathing free air for the first time in days. Samuel stood in the settling dust, his chest heaving, the barrel of his rifle warm in his hands. The camp was broken. 15 slavers lay dead or dying. Their weapons scattered, their wagons standing open and empty of human cargo. Natona rode in from the north, his expression grim but steady. He looked over the freed captives, 23 in all, then turned to Samuel. "You fought well," the chief said. "Like one of us." Samuel glanced back at the cages. No one should ever see the inside of one of those. Takaro stepped up, his earlier suspicion replaced with something more like respect. "You did not hide behind words, you acted. That matters." Ayana, pale but standing strong, came to Samuel's side. She spoke in Apache to her father, her hand resting lightly on Samuel's arm as she did. Natona listened, then gave a slow, approving nod. The captives were given water food from the warriors' packs, and the beginnings of care for their wounds. The sun was sliding into the horizon now, the sky painted in streaks of fire and blood. And Samuel knew this fight, as hard as it had been, was only a piece of something larger that was waiting out there in the desert. The heat from the battle still clung to the air, even as the last traces of gunpowder drifted away on the breeze. The creek ran quietly beside the clearing now, its soft murmur a strange contrast to the chaos that had filled this place minutes ago. Samuel crouched near one of the freed children, offering her a sip from his canteen. She drank greedily, coughing a little before handing it back. Her small hand lingered on his for a moment, and something in her eyes told him she didn't quite understand what had just happened, only that she was no longer in a cage. Natona moved among the captives, speaking in a calm, steady voice. Even those who didn't understand his language seemed to take comfort in the tone. Takaro stood nearby, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. His eyes met Samuel's, and for the first time there was no challenge in them, only acknowledgement. "You stayed when you could have run," Takaro said, almost like it was a fact he'd been testing all along. Samuel wiped the sweat from his brow. Running wouldn't have sat right with me. Takaro studied him for a moment longer, then gave a short nod and turned back toward the warriors preparing the horses for travel. Kolo approached, helping the injured Mexican woman settle onto a makeshift pallet strapped to one of the sturdier mounts. "She'll need a healer when we get back to our camp," he said. Samuel glanced toward the horizon where the sun was starting to sink. "We can make it before nightfall." "Not to our home," Kolo replied. "Too far with wounded. We have a halfway place, safe enough for the night." Natona joined them, his presence drawing the attention of every man in the clearing. "We move now," he said. "The slavers will have friends. Word will spread fast." Samuel mounted the dark-coated horse they'd given him earlier. Ayana came alongside, her expression still pale, but her voice stronger than before. "You fight like you have done this before," she said. "I haven't," Samuel answered, "but I know what it's like to lose someone. That's enough." They rode out as the sky bled into deep gold and violet. The line of warriors moved with silent discipline, the freed captives riding in the center for protection. Samuel kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see riders in pursuit, but the only movement behind them was the wind chasing shadows across the open land. After an hour, the terrain shifted, low hills broke into rocky gullies, and the air cooled. The group filed into a narrow canyon, its walls high and steep, a natural shield from the outside world. Natona signaled a halt. "We rest here," he said. "Fire's low, no sound that carries." The warriors dismounted, moving with quiet efficiency to tend to the wounded and pass out food. Samuel helped lift one of the weaker children down from a horse, wrapping a blanket around her small shoulders. Ayana knelt by the fireless circle, speaking softly to two freed women. One of them began to cry, the sound muffled but raw. Samuel looked away, giving them privacy, but the sound stayed with him. Takaro approached, crouching beside where Samuel sat against a rock. For a long moment, he said nothing. "Then Natona says you are under his protection now. That means something to our people. But it also means you are part of our fight." Samuel met his eyes. "I didn't think I was signing on for more than today." Takaro's expression didn't change. "The men we killed tonight were only one camp. There are others, some bigger, some worse. They take Apache Mexican white, it makes no difference to them. All are worth silver to the traders in the East." Samuel's hands tightened around his knees. "Then they all need to be stopped." Takaro tilted his head slightly, as though weighing his words. "That's what I wanted to hear." Across the camp, Natona was speaking quietly with Kolo. His deep voice carried just enough for Samuel to catch a fragment, test him again. He didn't know what that meant yet, but the tone told him it wasn't over. Later, as darkness settled, Samuel found himself beside Ayana once more. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest, the firelight catching the faint smile that played at the corner of her mouth. "You did more than save me," she said suddenly. He looked at her confused. "What do you mean?" "You made them see that not all white men are the same," she replied. "Even Takaro." Samuel gave a small, tired laugh. That might be the biggest miracle of the day. Her smile deepened just enough to soften her features, but then her eyes grew serious again. "You should know helping us is dangerous. The more you ride with us, the more you will be hunted by others. Some will be your own kind." Samuel leaned back against the rock, staring at the canyon walls that cut them off from the rest of the world. "Then I guess I'll have to get used to being hunted." Ayana didn't answer, but the look she gave him said she understood exactly what that meant. The night deepened, the air growing colder, but sleep wouldn't come easily. Somewhere out there beyond the sheltering rock, the desert was carrying word of what they had done, and there was no taking it back. The canyon walls trapped the night air, making it colder than Samuel expected. The warriors kept their fires small, just embers tucked behind rock shelves, and their voices low enough that they never carried beyond a few feet. Every sound from the dark beyond the walls felt sharper here. The scrape of a boot on stone, the muffled snort of a horse, the faint rustle of wind in the dry brush above. Samuel sat with his back against a boulder, watching Natona make his rounds. The chief stopped at each group, the wounded, the freed captives, the warriors on guard, speaking just enough to give orders or reassurance. Takaro stood at the canyon mouth, a dark figure against the faint glow of starlight, his rifle balanced across his forearms. Ayana sat cross-legged near Samuel, wrapping strips of cloth into makeshift bandages for anyone who needed them. She worked quietly until her eyes lifted to him. "You don't sleep," she said softly. "Never been good at it when the air feels like this," Samuel replied. Like what she asked. He scanned the canyon's shadows, like troubles deciding which road it's going to take to get here. She didn't smile, but her eyes said she understood. Kolo approached, crouching beside them. "Takaro says the scouts saw dust on the horizon just before nightfall," he said. "Might be nothing. Might be riders." "Slavers," Samuel asked. Kolo's mouth tightened. "Or men who think the slavers were wronged." That thought didn't sit well. Samuel glanced toward the freed captives, most already huddled together in exhausted sleep. "If they come here, we won't be able to move the wounded fast enough." Natona appeared then, his presence pulling all three of them to attention. "We leave before first light," he said. "The halfway place is no longer safe." Takaro's voice drifted in from the shadows near the canyon mouth. "We ride east," he said, "hard and fast. If they follow, we make them regret it." The chief gave a short nod. "Wake the men quietly. No noise that carries." The preparations began in near silence. Horses saddled, waterskins filled, the freed captives coaxed awake with soft voices. Samuel helped an older woman to her feet, steadying her as she moved toward the line of riders forming in the dark. When they set out, the canyon amplified every hoofbeat, but once they cleared the narrow pass, the sound faded into the open desert. The sky was paling by the time they found the dry riverbed Natona chose as their route. It offered some cover, the high banks hiding them from distant eyes. An hour into the ride, Takaro rode up alongside Samuel. "You handle a rifle well," he said without preamble. "I've had to." Samuel answered. Takaro studied him, then looked ahead again. "It will be tested again soon." Samuel didn't ask what he meant. He figured he'd find out. By mid-morning, the heat began to build. The pace slowed for the sake of the wounded, and tension settled over the group like a second sun. That's when one of the scouts came thundering back, his horse lathered. "Riders," he called in Apache, his voice low but urgent. "Coming fast. Too many to count yet." Natona's hand went up, bringing the column to a halt. He looked to Takaro, who was already scanning the ridges. "We can make a stand in the rocks ahead," the war leader said. "Narrow ground. They can't outflank us." Kolo translated quickly for Samuel. "We're not running. We're going to meet them head on." Samuel's pulse picked up, but he nodded. "Then let's make sure they don't get through." The group moved toward the rocky pass. Takaro had indicated a tight cut between two ridges where the land funneled into a bottleneck. Warriors dismounted to position themselves on higher ground, rifles ready. Samuel took position beside Kolo, near the center where the captives would be shielded. The first dust cloud appeared minutes later, low and rising fast. Shapes emerged, at least 20 riders armed and riding hard. They slowed when they saw the Apaches braced for them, but they didn't stop. One of them called out in rough English, "You've got something that's ours." Takaro answered in the same language, his voice like iron. "You come for chains you leave in the ground." The man spat into the dirt and gave a sharp hand signal. The riders spread, searching for an opening that didn't exist. Ayana's voice came from behind Samuel. "They will test us before they commit," she said. "See if we break." "They'll be disappointed," Samuel replied, adjusting his rifle against his shoulder. The standoff stretched the desert heat, pressing down like a weight. Every breath felt like it could be the one before the first shot. Natona's eyes swept the line, meeting Samuel's for just a heartbeat, a silent question, a reminder that this was no longer just their fight, but his too. And then one of the riders leaned forward in his saddle, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. The rider's fingers had barely touched the pistol grip when Takaro's rifle cracked. The shot echoed off the rock walls, the man tumbling backward out of his saddle before the others even processed what had happened. The sudden violence snapped the standoff like a dry twig. Shouts rose. Horses surged forward, and the sound of gunfire split the air. The riders charged straight into the narrow pass, their numbers forcing them into a single column where the Apaches' elevated positions turned the ground into a killing zone. Samuel worked the rifle's lever, the butt snug against his shoulder. His first shot dropped a man mid-gallop. The second struck another rider's horse, sending both tumbling in a tangle of dust and limbs. Beside him, Kolo fired with practiced rhythm, his eyes cold and steady. A bullet sparked off the rock near Samuel's head, peppering his cheek with grit. He ducked, shifted position, and found another target. The pass funneled the enemy so tightly that every shot counted. Still enough made it through to crash into the defensive line at the base. Noctona was there moving like a man half his age, his rifle flashing once before he swung it like a club into the jaw of a rider who got too close. The man hit the ground hard, and an Apache warrior finished him with a quick, efficient thrust of a knife. Samuel caught a glimpse of Ayanna helping one of the freed captives drag the children deeper into the protection of the rocks. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady, and that steadiness kept the terrified group moving. The fight at the pass became a churn of sound and motion, hooves pounding against stone, the snap of gunfire, the harsh grunt of men in close quarters. Samuel dropped his rifle when a slaver swung down from his horse and lunged at him with a short blade. The man's breath reeked of rot and cheap whiskey as their bodies slammed together. Samuel caught his wrist twisting until the blade clattered to the ground. They grappled in the dust, each straining for advantage. The man's hand clamped on Samuel's throat, squeezing hard enough to blur his vision, but Samuel drove a knee up into his gut and rolled him over. He landed 2 hard punches before Kolo appeared, yanking the man away and ending it with a single brutal stroke of his knife. "Back to your rifle," Kolo barked, already turning to fire at another attacker. Samuel grabbed the weapon and moved to cover the left flank where 2 riders had broken through and were trying to circle around. He sighted fired and saw one slump forward in the saddle, his horse veering off. The other was met by an Apache arrow that punched clean through his chest. The remaining enemy riders began to falter. The narrow pass, the elevated fire, and the sheer ferocity of the defense were breaking them. Takaro's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding in Apache. The warriors shifted, pressing the advantage. One final push drove the survivors into retreat. They wheeled their horses, spurring them hard back across the open ground, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The dust of their flight hung in the hot air like smoke after a fire. Silence fell, broken only by the harsh breathing of men and horses. Samuel lowered his rifle, scanning for the freed captives. They were safe, shaken, but unharmed. Ayanna met his eyes from across the clearing, a flicker of relief passing between them. Takaro strode over his face, streaked with dust and sweat. "You held," he said simply. "That matters." Samuel wiped his brow, feeling the tremor in his arms from the fight. "They won't be the last to come looking." Natona joined them, his gaze sweeping the pass and the fallen bodies. "No," he agreed, "but now they will remember this place and think twice." Fear is a weapon too. They set about tending to the wounded, stripping weapons from the dead, and clearing the path for the column to move. Samuel helped Kolo lift an injured warrior onto a horse, then went to check on Ayanna. She was sitting with the children again, her voice low and calming. "You did not run," she said without looking up. "Wouldn't have made it far if I tried." Samuel replied. She glanced at him, then the corner of her mouth lifting just slightly. "Still you stayed. That is what matters." The sun was already tilting westward, shadows lengthening across the rocks. Natona gave the order to move. The battle had been won, but the land ahead was still dangerous, and they could not linger in a place that had seen so much blood. The column formed again, the warriors riding silent eyes always scanning the horizon. Samuel took his place among them, the heat still beating off the stone, the smell of spent powder lingering in his nose. Every mile they put between themselves and the pass felt like buying time, but for what he wasn't yet sure. The trail east wound through broken country, a patchwork of jagged ridges and dry gulches where the sun's heat clung like a second skin. The horses moved at a steady trot, their shadows stretching long over the uneven ground. Samuel kept his eyes moving, scanning the ridge lines for any sign of movement, but the land seemed empty, too empty. Natona rode near the front, his posture as straight as if the battle in the pass had never happened. Takaro ranged ahead, disappearing into the folds of the land before reappearing at a higher point, always watching. The freed captives were kept in the center of the column, guarded on all sides. Ayanna rode among them, her dark hair whipping in the dry wind, her hand resting lightly on the shoulder of the youngest child. Kolo fell in beside Samuel after a time, passing him a canteen. "We'll make the safe place before nightfall," he said, his voice low. "If the horses hold." Samuel took a drink, the water lukewarm but welcome. "And if they don't," Kolo's eyes flicked toward the captives. "Then we camp where we must. But we'll keep moving as long as we can." The conversation was cut short when Takaro rode back into view, his horse lathered. Riders, he said in Apache before switching to English for Samuel's benefit. Small group, ahead of us. Not slavers. Scouts, maybe. Natona signaled the column to halt. Dust settled around them, the air heavy with waiting. We change course, the chief decided. We take the gulch. It will hide us. The turn was sharp, leading them down a narrow cut in the earth where the walls rose high enough to blot out much of the sun. The shade was a relief, but it came with a cost. Visibility was nearly nothing beyond the twisting bends of the trail. Every echo of hoof on stone sounded too close. Samuel leaned toward Kolo. If someone's waiting in here, we won't see them until we're breathing the same air. Kolo gave a short, grim nod. That's why Takaro's ahead. They pressed on the gulch, winding deeper until the air cooled enough to raise gooseflesh on Samuel's arms. Somewhere above a hawk's cry split the stillness, then faded into the distance. A sudden shout echoed from the front. Takaro's voice sharp and commanding. The column halted. Samuel pushed forward, weaving past riders until he reached the bend where Takaro sat on his horse rifle across his lap. Ahead, the gulch widened into a small basin. Two men stood there, each holding the reins of a weary-looking horse. Their clothing marked them as settlers, but their eyes were sharp, and their hands rested too easily near their gun belts. Natona rode forward slowly, his expression unreadable. "You block our way," he said in accented English. One of the men smiled thinly. Didn't mean to, just curious about such a large party traveling through this stretch. His gaze drifted over the captives, lingering too long. Takaro's voice was like a blade. "Your curiosity is dangerous." The man's smile didn't falter. "Dangerous is riding with that many guns, especially for a white man." His eyes shifted to Samuel. "You one of them now, or just lost?" Samuel met the man's stare without blinking. "Just moving through, like you should be." A tense silence followed. The other settler shifted his weight, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver. Takaro noticed his rifle angling slightly ready. Nachtona's voice cut through the stillness. "We have no quarrel unless you make one. Step aside." For a moment it seemed the men might press the matter. Then the one who had spoken first glanced at Takaro's rifle at the warriors on the ridge above the gulch and decided better of it. "Safe travels," he said, stepping back with exaggerated slowness. The column moved on, the tension lingering like a shadow. Samuel rode in silence for a while, but Ayana eventually brought her horse alongside his. "They were looking at the captive," she said quietly. "I saw," Samuel replied. "They will tell others she warned, and those others may follow." Her words sat heavy in his mind as the day wore on. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, the land began to open again, revealing a low shelf of rock dotted with scrub and a thin trickle of water. Natona called a halt, declaring it safe enough for the night. The warriors formed a perimeter while others tended to the horses and passed food to the captives. Samuel took a place near the edge of camp, scanning the dusky horizon. Kolo joined him after a while. "Tomorrow we reach the safe place," he said. "But tonight, we stay ready." Samuel nodded, his eyes never leaving the distance. The land out there was too quiet again, and he had the uneasy feeling that quiet in this country was rarely a gift. The night settled in with a heavy stillness, broken only by the soft murmur of water trickling over stone. A thin moon hung low, casting pale light over the camp, just enough to pick out the silhouettes of warriors posted along the perimeter. The freed captives huddled close to the small shielded fires, their voices hushed, every sound muffled by the weight of the land around them. Samuel sat near the edge of camp, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the rocks. The silence out there felt too deliberate, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Kolo approached quietly, crouching beside him. "Scouts will be out until dawn," Kolo said. "Takaro leads them. If trouble comes, we'll know before it reaches us." Samuel gave a slow nod. "Unless trouble's already here." Kolo's eyes flicked toward the shadows along the ridge. "You're thinking of the men in the gulch. They weren't just passing through," Samuel said. "They'll bring more. People like that always do." Kolo didn't argue. He simply rose and moved off into the dark, his steps silent on the stone. Ayana appeared next, carrying a small bundle of bandages she'd been rolling earlier. She knelt beside Samuel without a word and began rewrapping the cut on his forearm where a bullet had grazed him in the fight at the pass. Her hands were steady, her focus intent. "You're quiet tonight," she said finally. "Just thinking," Samuel replied. "About going back to your home." He shook his head. "About what happens if I do. You were right, riding with you puts a target on my back, but not riding would mean pretending I didn't see what's out here." She tied off the bandage and sat back on her heels. "Then you already know your answer." Before Samuel could respond, a sharp whistle cut through the night from the north perimeter. Warriors rose instantly, weapons in hand. Natona stepped from the shadows, his rifle already loaded. A scout appeared at a run, his breath quick but controlled. He spoke in Apache to the chief, the words low and clipped. Samuel couldn't understand, but the tension in Natona's face was enough. "They followed us," Natona said in English, his gaze sweeping the camp. "Small group for now, watching from the ridge." Takaro emerged from the darkness, his expression carved from stone. "They're testing our position," he said, counting numbers looking for weakness. Samuel stood gripping his rifle. "Then what are we waiting for?" Takaro's eyes narrowed. "Not enough of them to waste bullets on yet. They'll wait until we move, then call the others." Natona gave a short, decisive nod. "We break camp before first light. Double watch until then." The camp returned to a tense stillness, but sleep was out of the question. Samuel took the next watch with Takaro, both of them scanning the ridges, while the faint glow of the fires painted their faces in shifting light. After a long silence, Takaro spoke. "You shoot like a man who's had to feed himself without missing." Samuel smirked faintly. "That's one way to put it." Takaro's gaze didn't leave the ridge. "You also fight like a man who's lost someone and doesn't plan on losing again." Samuel didn't answer right away. "My wife," he said finally. 5 years ago. Fever took her before I could get help." Takaro gave the smallest of nods. "Loss can make a man careful, or it can make him dangerous. I think you're still deciding which." The first light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky when the scouts reported the ridge was clear. No movement, no sign of the watchers, but no one believed they were truly gone. By the time the horses were saddled and the captives mounted, the sun had cleared the horizon. Natona set a hard pace, the group moving in tight formation across the open flats toward the safe place Kolo had spoken of. The land began to rise ahead, the hills folding into each other to form a natural bowl. A thin line of cottonwoods marked the presence of water, and beyond them a scatter of low shelters made from timber and stone. "This is it," Kolo said, riding up beside Samuel. "A place between places. We can rest here before moving on." But even as they rode into the bowl, Samuel felt the hairs on the back of his neck lift. Something about the stillness here was wrong. No birds in the trees, no sound of movement in the shelters, just the quiet, heavy and expectant like the breath held before a storm. The horses slowed as the column entered the bowl, their ears flicking uneasily. Samuel's grip tightened on the reins, his eyes sweeping over the empty shelters. The timber walls bore no fresh tracks, no smoke curled from the stone chimneys. Even the trickle of water nearby seemed subdued, the sound swallowed by the stillness. Natona reined in at the center, scanning the perimeter with the caution of a man who had walked into too many traps. Takaro circled wide, his rifle resting loosely in his hands, though his gaze missed nothing. Kolo dismounted near the first shelter, motioning for Samuel to follow. They stepped inside the air stale and heavy with dust. A pot lay overturned in the hearth, its contents long dried. A blanket half unrolled rested in the corner as if its owner had left in a hurry. "They left fast," Kolo murmured. "Or were made to," Samuel replied, his voice low. Outside, Ayana was helping the captives dismount, her eyes darting toward the tree line. She caught Samuel's glance and shook her head subtly. No sign of life anywhere. Natona raised a hand signaling silence. The warriors stilled their senses, sharpening as they listened. A faint sound drifted in from beyond the cottonwoods, a single creak of wood under strain. Takaro moved first, slipping toward the trees with 2 other warriors. Samuel followed without thinking, keeping low. They passed through the cottonwoods into a narrow gully where the scent of smoke hung faintly in the air. Then Samuel saw it, an old wagon tipped on its side, a wheel still turning slowly in the breeze. Beyond it lay the remains of a campfire, cold but recently doused. Tracks led away to the north, the ground churned by many hooves. Takaro knelt, brushing his fingers over the prints. 2 days, he said. Maybe less. Not settlers. Too organized. Samuel's gut tightened. The scouts we saw yesterday could have driven them out. Natona joined them, his expression grim. Or taken them. This place is no longer safe. The words seemed to hang in the air, pulling the weight of every mile they had traveled. Samuel thought of the captives they had risked so much to free the wounded, barely clinging to their saddles. Moving again would mean pushing them past their limits. Back in the bowl, the warriors gathered quickly. Takaro's voice carried across the clearing. We cannot stay here. If they are hunting us, they will come here first. Kolo frowned. But the wounded Natona cut him off. We find another way east. There is a narrow gulch 3 miles from here. Hard to reach, harder to leave. It will hide us until they pass. Ayana spoke up, her tone steady despite the worry in her eyes. If they were taken, they will be moved fast. We should follow. Samuel looked at her. We've got people who can't ride much farther. Chasing will only leave them behind. Her gaze met his, and he saw the frustration there. If we do nothing more, we'll vanish. The chief listened to them both, then turned to Samuel. You ride with us now. You see the choice. Which would you make? It was the kind of question Samuel had avoided most of his life, choosing between safety and action, between protecting the few or risking for the many. His eyes drifted to the captives clustered near the horses, their faces worn from fear and exhaustion. Then he looked to Ayana, her stance unflinching, and to Takaro, whose expression carried the weight of every raid he had fought. I say we hide them first, Samuel said finally. Get them to the gulch. Once they're safe, we ride after whoever left those tracks. Natona studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. Then that is the way. The decision set the camp into motion. Warriors moved among the horses, tightening cinches and checking weapons. Samuel helped Kolo lift one of the wounded into a saddle, his mind already on the trail ahead. The air in the bowl felt heavier now, as if the shadows themselves were pressing closer. As they prepared to leave, a scout came riding hard from the western ridge. His horse lathered, his eyes wide. He spoke quickly to Natona, the words tumbling out like stones down a slope. Takaro's head snapped toward the tree line, his grip tightening on his rifle. They're coming, he said in English, his voice low but sharp. Samuel felt the muscles in his neck tense. How many? Takaro's answer was grim. Enough that running will not be simple. The riders wheeled toward the northern edge of the bowl, the first faint plumes of dust already rising in the distance. The ground seemed to vibrate beneath Samuel's boots, a low growing tremor that promised the fight wasn't done, not by a long shot.